Okay.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to whatever the hell this thing is that I do on occasion poorly. Uh, something like a podcast. This is John Wood Jr. Say hello to my peeps, John.
Howdy, folks. How's everybody doing?
Pretty good. Pretty good. All right. So first off, what I want to say is that you and I are both musicians under lockdown in Los Angeles for an incredibly, inordinately cruel period of time. How are you faring?
Well, I've got a lot to be grateful for. First of all, let me say that I'm looking forward, if you're up for it, to talking a bit of music. You, my friend, are a real musician. I impersonate one a little bit, but music is a big part of who I am, big part of my family. I am a trumpet player, I am a singer, but I'm just rusty as all get out, So it's not, lockdown hasn't interrupted my musical life so much as just the rest of life has. But I'm grateful because, for a few reasons. We've got kids. Me and my wife, we've got 3 kids, live in South Los Angeles. We've homeschooled our kids since just about the beginning.
Good for you.
Yeah. Well, it's just the choice that we made, and we had reasons for making that choice, which, I'm happy to tell you a bit about if you're curious. But what that meant, though, was that when the rest of the state and so much of the rest of the country went into a period where you had to pull your kids out of school because of the whole issue, and parents had to figure out how to educate their kids at home.
You already knew.
Yeah, that was really not much of a transition for us at all. That was just sort of more of the same. The other reason that I'm grateful is the fact that, and I say this with the utmost, sensitivity and appreciation for the fact that this is a hard time for so many of us. It has been a hard time, but I'm privileged enough to feel fairly useful during this period of time. Don't get to travel like I used to. That's too bad. But I was already doing a fair amount of work from the computer before the lockdown started. And what my work is about is helping people to be able to see the humanity in one another and to work together in a civil sort of capacity. And the need for that in America has only, I think, risen over the course of this lockdown. And so I, on the one hand, am dismayed by the strength of the problem. On the other hand, I'm happy to be, doing a little bit in my own capacity, just like I think you are and others are, to be a part of the solution. And so in that sense, I'm grateful to have a purpose through all of this madness, so counting my blessings.
Well, and as a person who was traveling to do a lot of your work, your reach has been more flexible now that everybody expects not to travel and went ahead and got a webcam and went ahead and learned how to use Zoom. I mean, was Zoom always a thing before this? Because I don't think I ever heard of it until the pandemic started, and suddenly I found myself needing to come online.
Yeah, well, I mean, Zoom was certainly a thing. Actually, I already had a fairly Zoom-based, fairly strong Zoom-based portion of my existence, just because Braver Angels, which is America's largest grassroots bipartisan organization, working.
And it's in every state.
Organization, right? Yeah, we are not. We don't have a home office.
Right.
We're all over the place. And so we've been doing Zoom meetings together for a while. And, I would do Zoom podcasts, so on and so forth. But I was also stepping foot on college campuses. I was also, walking into communities, doing live events where you could hug folks and shake hands, pat each other on the back, etc. Braver Angels in general was all about face-to-face activities, in-person gatherings. We did a little bit of stuff over Zoom, but it was not much. We had to shift the whole thing. The whole kit and caboodle had to come over on the digital side after the lockdown. But you're right. It did sort of, in a way, open up a lot of new opportunities. You can connect with people across greater distances more easily via Zoom. You can get more people in a Zoom room, if you do it the right way. And kind of expanded our reach. So I don't know which way you want to go with any of that.
Yeah, I've got a few questions I could kind of steer us a little bit. First, I wanted to just kind of establish that since this is a conservative channel, and oh my God, we're so suspect of each other these days. I just want to make it clear that you actually ran for Congress as a Republican.
Yes.
That
Yes, I did. Mm-hmm.
you were courageous enough to be the vice chairman of the Republican Party in Los Angeles. Let's let the applause die down all over the country for a second here. So this man can be trusted. That's what I'm saying. Isn't it weird that we have to? I was talking to a friend the other day, and they asked me, what are there any conservatives at all in LA? And I said, of course, they're the ones. If you go to a party, the ones not talking politics, those are the conservatives. They're not allowed to speak. You know.
Yeah.
Were you ever a Democrat? Most of us are default Democrats when we, are young.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Well, the answer to that question is yes. Let me say very quickly that it's a little bit ironic. The Republican Party of Los Angeles County is actually the largest Republican county party in America, right? It is the largest Republican county party in America by virtue of the number of registered Republicans in the county. Unfortunately, there's still about 4 times as many registered Democrats in LA. It makes it the largest Democratic county party in America. And so that's the way that shakes out. But, in raw numbers, there are a lot of Republicans in LA. But to your question, no, I very much grew up a Democrat. I come from a family that was mostly Democrat on both sides. Well, now let me tell you a little bit of the story. So when I was running for Congress, I ran for Congress against Maxine Waters. It was 2014. I was the youngest active nominee for Congress in the state at the time. I had a little bit of a canned opening line that I would use whether I was speaking to a Black Democratic-leaning church in South Los Angeles or to a predominantly white Tea Party club in South Bay LA County. What I tell folks is, well, people would ask me, they'd say, at the age of 26, what makes you qualified to represent a district as complex and diverse as the California 43rd in Los Angeles? And I had a bit of a canned response. I would say, well, I have an interesting sort of family background. My mother's a liberal Black Democrat from inner city Los Angeles. My father's a conservative white Republican from Tennessee. I grew up explaining my father to my mother and my mother to my father, and that's why I think I can represent a lot of you. People tended to appreciate that framing. Now, the truth is that both of my parents were registered Democrats when I was growing up, but my father was always the traditionalist in our household, and he did indeed become registered Republican later on. My dad my dad always thought of, I think, the Wood family as being Kennedy Democrats, in essence. My grandfather was a record industry executive back in the late 50s, early 60s. Grandpa founded the biggest independent record label in America back then. It was called Dot Records, which you probably know, Dave, but that was Pat Boone's record label, Lawrence Welk, Billy Vaughn, groups like the Del Vikings, red country artists even like Red Foley. Had a very eclectic catalog. Before that, Grandpa started the first radio show in America. Actually, it was a mail-order record shop that sponsored a radio show by the same name called the Randy's Record Shop, and it broadcast out of WLAC in Nashville, Tennessee.
Wow.
And yes, sir. And it was the first such radio show in America to broadcast rhythm and blues and gospel music, basically Black music, to a national audience. And, Grandpa was a white man who had a deep love and appreciation for Black culture and for Black music. And so that radio show launched the careers of Arthur Alexander and Mahalia Jackson and Little Richard. Fats Domino called and sang my grandfather happy birthday. This would have been, 20 some odd years ago. And, Grandpa has since passed, but Fats loved him very much. Solomon Burke came and visited my grandfather's recording studio in the 90s and took my grandfather's picture off the wall and kissed it and said, I owe this man $100,000,
Did he ever pay that? Could I plug something in here real quick?
Go for it.
I did a video a while back called Motown versus Martin Luther King versus Motown versus MLK. And I made the case that we teach young Black people young kids to lionize the activists and to lionize Martin Luther King and other people that were admittedly hugely important at that time. But we haven't, but really the heavy hitting was going on since Louis Armstrong in music, in popular culture, and particularly with Motown, because they were a crossover. They went ahead and sounded in such a way, largely by bringing in the strings from the Detroit Symphony. And they sweetened their sound in a way that Stax wasn't doing. You know, Stax was more comfortable sort of being a race label. But Motown went for the mainstream and everybody embraced it. And they would go on, they would do these package tours, and the white kids and black kids would all be dancing together. And I thought they had really done so much already for civil rights since 1957 that it sort of made it sort of made it possible for the civil rights movement to really get underway in the early 60s. And I'm just saying that not to take the glory away from Martin Luther King, but to understand that there were some people that were really doing it in the culture already, bringing people together. That's I just wanted to plug that in.
Well, no. So my father, my dad always said to me growing up, he said good music, you know, back in those days, he said good music was the order of the day, and it was good music that powered the civil rights movement, right?
Yes.
Martin Luther King Jr., we always assumed anyway, I don't know if this was ever confirmed, but we always assumed that Dr. King was listening to the Randy's record shop, just given where he grew up. The record shop was listened to almost, you know, universally in the Black South. One thing I do know is that Muhammad Ali wrote a letter to my grandfather, thanking him for all the music. It was delivered to us by way of Howard Bingham, who was the famous sports photographer who followed Muhammad Ali around for many years. And Ali listened to the record shop growing up in Louisville, Kentucky. You're absolutely right. And there's no contradiction between the two. I mean, you know, on the one hand, of course, you need men and women of principle to take a stand for a better society, for society that comes closer to the ideals that we all share some allegiance to. This idea that we are endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, that we are created equal, and that we ought seek a society that honors that, right?
Yes.
But, you know, it's not just a matter of making an argument. It's also a matter of us getting to know one another, to share the sounds of the spirit that allows to actually connect as brothers and sisters, people who are raised from dust to be something more than animals, you know? And you really get that in music, because that connects the hearts of men and of women, you know?
Right. And it's particularly in a way that just approaches human concerns in general, as opposed to what was happening. What the music that sort of got attached to the civil rights movement was really folk music, which was too on the nose. It was overtly political in some ways. You know, there was the old singing of spirituals and things like that. But the songs being written by, you know, like white folk singers coming out of the New York folk scene, sort of attaching themselves to the civil rights movement, was all very preachy. And so, you know, my first engagement with Braver Angels has been through the Braver Angels songwriters. And my first meeting with those folks, I said, look, I think what we should do is just sing songs about the human heart, human concerns, and then say, oh, by the way, I'm a conservative. Right. By the way, you know, just as an aside, once you've established the link, then you can just mention, as opposed to saying it first and then, you know, and then saying, okay, now here's my song where I forgive you for disagreeing with me.
Well, okay, so I agree with you. I do want to say that, you know, so I was raised in a bit of a time capsule. You know, it's a funny thing. So my grandfather, like I said, you know, founded the Randy's Record Shop and Dot Records. My dad was a jazz pianist, you know, and you know, grew up deeply immersed in all sorts of great music, but jazz is his thing. On my mom's side of the family, my mom's a rhythm and blues. My mom's an R&B singer. She used to dance on Soul Train back in I guess it would have been the late 70s, early 80s. and her brother-in-law was a gangster rapper by the name of, went by the handle of Mac 10. He was a part of Ice Cube's group after he left NWA. My father had a deep kind of aversion to rap and hip hop and so forth, but the two of them always got along, right? And so ironies abound. But there is this musical tradition in American society that I think really picks up in the '60s, like you're mentioning, with activist music that's kind of on the nose, trying to make a social, political point. And even though the styles are dramatically different and so forth, there's a way in which you can kind of draw a line, just in that narrow sense, from Bob Dylan to Ice Cube, if you will, right?
Yes.
People using music to make a political point. Now, my feeling about that is that I actually feel like there's a lot of great music that has come out of that kind of frame. I mean, Tim Buckley, photographs of guns and planes, and the cannons start to roar, but no man can find the war. Our politics, our social,
Let me grab a guitar.
See, that's what I'm missing.
I'm going to jam.
They do elicit deep human response. It's not just a matter of our intellectual opinions, our feelings get wrapped up in the way the world is. And so it makes sense that music should play a role in allowing us to communicate our beliefs. My deal is just that it can't be limited to that.
Well, and I think because having been a folk singer I was surrounded on all sides by very, very liberal people. And I, of course, myself was a Democrat, but there was this sense of, there was kind of a rote feeling to a lot of it. You go see a folk singer and they, at some point in the show, they were going to sing a song in Spanish. Just like, why are we, I don't know, we just all do it, and there was going to be something that they would let you in on their political beliefs in a sort of, staring down or gazing down their patrician nose at you in the audience. But there was the assumption that everybody in the audience already agreed with them. So nobody was very careful to do it with grace, like the song that you just sang, where you really are doing it from a human perspective. It was more overt, and it would just alienate anybody in the audience who might really benefit by hearing the message that you're trying to get across to them. They just kind of slammed their little door because I'm being talked down at. So
right, yeah. Well, no, I see exactly what you're saying, and whether it's there's a politicization that can happen to music, and that does happen to music. I think in the way that you're describing, that can sterilize it.
Yes.
Or otherwise make it something that doesn't allow us to reach deeper. The commercialization of music can do something similar. As soon as we start making art for reasons that have less to do with sort of opening a window, into facets of the human soul, and more to do with trying to achieve a material end or trying to signal some virtue to your peers and so forth, the less powerful music becomes.
Right. And I think we've all been reminded in the last few years just how easy it is to make everybody tribe up. We really have not in any way conquered our tendency to become tribal. It doesn't take much to set that off. So we always have to be, I think maybe I'm particularly sensitive to this sort of thing because I know that we've all been locked up here. So there hasn't been any natural rubbing up against people who don't necessarily agree with you in just the normal day-to-day interactions that we would be having if we hadn't all been locked down for many months. So I'm a little particularly sensitive to it right now. I noticed I was laughing because I found myself on a debate on the thread of your debate about whether you should have the debate about the election. So I was on a debate about a debate about a debate. And I thought, well, can we roll this out once more? So you had a rather, that was probably the second most impressed by you I've been. The first being about the half hour mark on Brett Weinstein's podcast, where you were there with Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter and basically everybody. important young black conservative and just black conservatives,
Yeah.
or not
I would
actually
say most of them are
conservatives.
conservative. I mean,
And
some is more conservative. I wouldn't call John McWhorter conservative.
right.
But we're all folks who
Most
one
would
way
not.
or another are kind of pressing against some of the mainstream.
Yes, I would say probably Coleman Hughes would call himself a conservative, but the others probably wouldn't. You're
Well,
right.
Coleman wouldn't. No, Coleman wouldn't even call himself a conservative, really. I mean, Coleman is more left-leaning kind of guy in general, and I know Coleman a bit. But what Coleman would say is that he has serious problems with orienting our entire worldview in Black America and beyond around race and race alone. In some sense.
I agree, and that's why I didn't want to talk about race here with you today.
I mean, I'm happy to talk about it. It's an important subject. I, for one, am interested in it. But
you often get stuck with that. But it's funny because conservative, I think of conservative really in a way like when you're talking to your money manager and he says, well, how should I do it, liberally or should I do it conservatively? Everybody says, no, please, when we're talking my money, let's be conservative. Let's not do anything until it's shown to work. I think of it as more of a philosophical outlook. I think that liberals can be summed up in a sense by, we shall build the world we dream. And my philosophy is like, don't fix it if it's not broke. Right. Basically, I'm the kid in the wagon going down a hill who's dragging his foot. I'm going down the hill, but let's not necessarily do it at 90 miles an hour. Right. And it's just a certain innate caution that I feel that that even when I was a liberal, I was a more conservative liberal. I was a more conservative Democrat. And I think we just got to the place where there isn't a room on either side and either party really for people. There's not any liberal Republicans really now, or they're not welcome, or they're not, they don't feel like they have much of a home. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, that's absolutely true. Once upon a time, and interestingly, in that era of time that we were kind of looking back at, from the 50s and 60s for everything that was going on, you did have sort of some heterodoxy, if you will, some viewpoint diversity within each party. I mean, it's not to say that you don't today in a sense, but you're right, what you lack is, back then you had conservative Democrats, you had liberal Republicans, and they would use those labels, they weren't afraid to advertise themselves in that way. Now you got, what do you got? You got, I don't know, Joe Manchin on one side and maybe Adam Kinzinger, I don't know. Really, it's you don't get that in the parties.
But I wanted to jump back to what I was talking about with Brett, is about the half hour mark in there. You did the best summation of the sort of perfect storm of what has happened to Black America in about 5 minutes time off the top of your head. That should in itself be a miniature essay presented properly somewhere, because man, did you nail that? All factors. It was very nonpartisan. It was very non-judgmental. It was just honest about all these factors that happened all at once. And I thought, I have got to talk to this guy at some point, and I'm very grateful that you allowed that to happen. But that was very telling. But then the other thing, the other passionate moment that you had was in that.
By the way, can I just say about that?
Yes, please.
Can I just say about that, Dave, that if folks I actually did write an essay on that. So if folks are curious about what you're referring to, you can look up an essay I wrote called "The Pivotal Irony of American Racism." And just in a nutshell, what that essay is about is the idea that, in my opinion, the pivotal irony of American racism is that America actually did become less racist, I believe, certainly in our traditional sense of understanding the term racism, from the civil rights movement, the end of the civil rights movement to now. But at the same time, other factors were taking place, including the loss of economic opportunity, including the advent of the Great Society programs, including in particular the crack cocaine epidemic, the response of law enforcement, and all sorts of other things that conspired to make life for African Americans in this country, many, if not most, poor African Americans in this country, even worse than it had been in certain areas, at least in our big cities, before the gains of the civil rights movement took place, and that sets the stage for so much of the pain and the confusion and the social conflict that we see around race today. It's an underexplored part of our recent history.
And
so that's what that was about.
And there's a way in which, as expectations rise, people become, very anxious to have all those expectations suddenly appear in their full form. Mm-hmm. Whereas, you go to a poor country where nobody has anything, and you notice how happy everybody is. Well, nobody has any expectation. But when there's a few people living on the outskirts of town with big houses, things start getting troublesome. And in some ways, maybe there wasn't as many expectations before the civil rights movement came along. And then once there was, and everything didn't immediately turn into success, wall to wall, it's easier. I've always noticed that the sons of immigrants to this country, and you've seen this a lot, the fathers come in, and I've always dealt with the immigrants on work sites. I was a house painter for 35 years, and the guys that I'd meet on work sites, they were always so humble and so nice, and their English was poor, and they'd be happy to have a conversation because they were getting a chance to use their English. Their kids tend to be cranky. Their kids tend to be, because their fathers, they feel, didn't have the status in society. They feel like, but they feel fully American, but now they feel a gap between them and the sons of maybe the people who are employing their fathers to care for their lawns.
That's right. It's the difference between I'm just happy to be here and, hey, I'm an American citizen and I'm entitled to all the opportunities and so forth that you guys got, right?
Yeah. Now that I have my rights, I have the right to be mad about my rights. And
that, no, you're hitting on something very, very important. I mean, I just said that for many African Americans, life in many respects actually got worse after the civil rights movement, but for many others, it really did get better. Of course, that's absolutely true.
Yes.
But to your point, I mean, that's part of what's going on. You have greater expectations because of the success of the civil rights movement. The Revolutionary War was not entirely dissimilar. It's an interesting thing to think about. If you go all the way back to the founding of our country and you compare I believe the life expectancy, the general health, the freedom and opportunity that was available to British subjects living in the American colonies versus British subjects who are living in London, which was small, congested, highly regulated and dominated by the king, the government, so on and so forth, under the sort of conspicuous kind of, oversight of the nobility, of the aristocracy. Americans enjoyed a much higher quality of life than British people did at the very time we were arguing for full rights of, the sort of equal standing with our fellow British subjects because we didn't have a vote in the House of Commons. But you would have much rather been an American. But in America, you had this philosophical conversation taking place over freedom and what it meant to really be in control of your own destiny. English subjects in England weren't thinking about that quite as much because they didn't have those expectations. They didn't have this whole new world that they have they could feel their own ability to kind of influence and so forth. And so, in America, we were willing to fight for a dream, that would have sounded crazy to folks in Europe and to folks in Great Britain, So, I mean, it's a weird thing, man, but there was part of how things changed.
There was a little bit of a snowflake thing going on with our founding fathers. They were very indignant about things that maybe few people in the planet had the right to be indignant about. They had it pretty good enough that they could see something even better. That's right. They got within sight of something great, and boy, then not being already at the great thing becomes very painful when you can see it.
I mean, I'm glad that they were, because it gives you and I the opportunity to be here and to, reap those benefits and so forth. But yeah, there is this irony. And so, I'm a bit forgiving of folks for wanting something better. But to your point about conservatism, and really, look, I don't know if you've ever checked out Jordan Peterson too much, but he speaks to this issue.
Right.
Ideally, the basic, take all the politics out of it for a second. Mm-hmm. The basic elemental sort of reality of there being kind of a liberal personality and a conservative personality. Ideally, those things would work hand in hand, you know,
Yes.
because it's important to have folks who will, you know, push for something better, will push for something new, will push for change, who will point out the ways in which things may not be working right. But it's also vital that we have folks who are willing to hang on to the things that aren't broken, who are able to keep us from throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? You need both of that, I think, in both of those things in a society. And one of the reasons I'm conservative is just the fact that, you know, I feel like on the one hand, yeah, there are changes I want to see in society. Sure, I actually think liberals and progressives have all sorts of good points on things, but you know, I don't want to lose the foundations of what has made this the most impactful nation in the world in terms of advancing humanity's expectation of the greater dignity that is possible for human life, right? And that has to do with our religious history. It has to do with our Constitution. It has to do with our intellectual and classical liberal sort of foundations in terms of how we've set up our civic structures in American life. It has to do with all sorts of things that we too readily take for granted today. And so, you know, but ideally these things would work together and not consistently be at war.
That's why it's so important. What the work you've taken on is, you can look at any of the major problems we've had recently, and you can say, really, the real problem was the divide. If people had been able to, in good faith, sit down and listen to each other, and if people weren't caucusing with people just like them, but were rather caucusing with people where the rule was that there has to be a mix of people before we start the conversation, then you have the ability to hear all sides. I happen to believe that there is, I'm with Jonathan Haidt on this, and you mentioned heterodoxy earlier, and he said recently that ideology is not the problem. Orthodox ideology is the problem. That's, of course, why he calls his organization the Heterodox Academy.
Right.
And
he's a board member here at Braver Angels as well, by the way. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Wonderful. But I have this feeling that we are just designed by God or nature to balance each other, that two heads are better than one, but only if two types of heads are present. If it's two identical heads, then two heads is just a really large head. You and I know about really large heads. But you know, the best relationships, and I try to tell this to my very, you know, some most resistant listeners to the idea of talking across the divide. I say, name me a relationship in your life that has not consisted of compromise largely. You don't get your way with your boss. You don't get your way with your wife. You have to get some portion of your way balanced out by some portion of her way. And doesn't that always end up having been a better plan in the end? But people are willing to see it with their boss and their wife and their kids and their neighbors, but they're not willing to see it with this weirdly removed and sort of AM radio-ified version of who these other people are. We get an isolated tweet. Oh, look at this tweet from this actress. How stupid this is. This is how they think. That's all of them, you know, and our tribal natures make us attracted to the thing that makes us angry, because if we were living in the wild, that's important information to know where the danger is. So we're designed to pay attention to what's dangerous to us, because that could be life and death. You know what I mean? So just like, somebody insults me on one of my videos, I forget about the fact that was surrounded by 25 people on each side who were giving me a thumbs up.
No, that's absolutely right. We tend to hone in on the negative, and even if it's a small part of the picture, it becomes the whole picture, because there is a part of us that's inclined to obsess over it. Not to say that our differences aren't real and deep and profound. They are, and becoming more so day by day. But it's interesting to note, I could be in a room with two individuals, right? And if it's just a question of, how do we feel on this issue? Let's say, school choice or something like that. I have a conservative over here, liberal over here. They can go, toe to toe on the policy points and come away from the conversation feeling like we've got nothing in common with each other because all we were doing was arguing. And the fact that, they might have lined up on 5 or 10% of things, like let's say, actually, we need to make sure that if a teacher is underperforming, even if you've got strong unions, that there can also be accountability. They might agree on a thing like that, but it doesn't matter because, at the end of the day, you're a socialist and, I care about freedom, liberty, and what do we have to do with each other? You take almost those same two people or two same very, very similar people, and if you put them in a context to where they actually have to work together to make the school in their neighborhood work, right? You've actually got to work together to see to it that their kids who go to school in the same district are able to collaborate, able to communicate. They'll zero in, if they're serious, they'll zero in on that 10% of things they agree on. Look, we disagree on all this stuff, but we need greater teacher accountability. We need some change in the regulation out here because we need to expand campus so we can do more things for our kids. But, that's going to take a change in the local law, local ordinance. They'll work together on that 5 or 10% of issues and be on the same team by the end of that process, because what mattered most was not the areas in which they disagreed and couldn't do anything about it, but the areas in which they did agree and could make a difference. And as that happens, suddenly we get to understand and listen a little bit more deeply to where the other side is actually coming from. And we can start to imagine together, okay, what does the best of our perspectives working together actually produce in a society that we collaborate on improving side by side, right? Suddenly we're Americans again. We're neighbors again.
I've often told any woman I've ever been in a relationship with, I've said, we're going to do our best work shoulder to shoulder, looking at a common thing, be it a project or a problem, than sitting here staring into one another's eyes, expecting each other to fulfill the other. If so, like you just said, side by side, approaching a problem. If the part of the Venn diagram that connects you at the shoulder is enough to hold you there long enough to take on a project together, then suddenly all the parts that are outside the Venn diagram start looking like additional tools in the toolbox.
There you go.
You start saying, okay, hey, you know what? They're going to hear you a lot better than me on this one. So I'm going to be quiet over here, and let you handle this because you're closer to this person that we're trying to negotiate with right now through your natural tendency than I am. So
shoulder to shoulder. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. We've got to create the space for us to be able to stand shoulder to shoulder together rather than sort of, evaluate our willingness to actually relate to each other on the basis of how much our orthodoxies line up, because we're never going to get anywhere that way.
Right.
But we do all have, we do have kids, we do have grandchildren, we do have streets where the potholes need to be filled. We've got air that we want to breathe cleanly. We want folks to be able to live good lives. And if we can kind of reset the frame in which we interact a little bit, we can start to get there again, so you put it correct.
I agree. This upcoming debate thing, I wanted to mention that you had only really spoken once on the debate about the upcoming debate. Is that tonight?
Yeah, so the day in which you and I are having this conversation is March 4th. Don't know when you're going to release this episode, but yeah, so we've got a debate tonight on voter fraud. Is it a major problem in America? Within which a big part of what we're going to be talking about is, was the outcome of the 2020 election fair? Or was the election stolen? Was this legitimate? Was it credible? We're going to have folks who think it was totally on the level and folks who think that it was not, So yeah, that's what we're talking about tonight.
I think it's mildly concerning to me. And somebody had mentioned this, it may have been you, that the people, you really just spoke one time and you got a little passionate toward the end of it there on your comment on this past little debate.
Oh, you're talking about a podcast that we recorded. So I recorded, several Brave Angels leaders, including our president, David Blankenhorn, myself, my colleagues, Kieran O'Connor, April Lawson, and Silas
That's what I
Kulkarni.
was talking about. I guess I wasn't clear about that.
Yeah, no. We had a podcast that we recorded just a few days ago because the pushback against our being willing to host this conversation was so severe, even within our own team to a degree. My good friend and colleague Silas, who I love and respect deeply, himself didn't think that we should do this. So we thought, okay, let's have a special conversation so to bring Braver Angels members and the outside community into outside public into understanding why we decided to do this, why it was important to do. So that's what you're referring to, Dave.
And I am quite certain that if Trump had won and it had been close and the other side had been calling out for more investigation into what might have gone on behind the scenes, we conservatives would be just as opposed to talking about it. What? This is settled, and this is one of those things that, again, that comes out of this divide. We've gotten to the place where we really have lost this basic glue of society, which is trust. We're a trust-based society. When you're in some cultures, you go into a store and it's assumed that the storekeeper is going to try to screw you, and you're going to try to screw him, and you're going to then haggle your way to a price you can both live with. But in this, I used to go down to Mexico quite frequently when I was young, and that's not really a trust-based society. Although I find every Mexican person I know to be completely worthy of trust, but they have this bakshish, going, this little payola thing going on there. That's part of their culture. We have managed to not have that in the United States, where you go into a store, and unless you're buying a guitar or a car, everything, maybe a stereo system, everything else is the price as marked. So we don't haggle over everything. We had a society where we want to trust one another. We want to feel like, yes, I can take my car in and I can trust a guy to tell me the truth about it. We've always had consumer protection people popping up to make sure that trust is established and protected. We're losing that voluntarily now by not listening to one another, and by only taking in news that we can trust will affirm our biases and not make us feel uncomfortable by the end of the broadcast. And we are really sacrificing this very important thing. And boy, the election system, and I've gotten in so much trouble because I have not just gone 100% on the stolen election narrative. And frankly, I don't want to think that my neighbors here in Altadena are cheats. The ones who work the election, here. I don't want to think that just thousands and thousands and thousands of Americans were just cheating that night. I just don't, and I don't think it. It's not just that I don't want to think it. I don't think it. But it's made me very, very unpopular right now. But there's been this sense of we can't trust each other all through the Trump presidency. And there's also a sense going way back, even before he was inaugurated, that there was a real effort to get rid of him basically the whole time. So why wouldn't that convert to suspicion that if they could, they would cheat?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Now, I mean, look, that's a perfectly clear and strong point, really. I mean, the truth is that the more we distrust each other, the more reason we have to distrust each other, right? Because distrust builds on distrust. So what we're trying to do is reverse that cycle. Look, I mean, I tend to be a little bit closer to you on the particular issue in question. I don't necessarily think that, voter fraud was exactly the thing that tipped the election. I do, on the other hand, think that the way the media covered the election, the mainstream media, the way the social media platforms operated, sort of shutting down, I think, without due cause, conservative publications, and in various sorts of ways seeming to kind of tip the regulatory scales against people with conservative opinions. I do think that those things amount, in a sense, to something of a rigging of the game. But we have to keep everything in context, and we have to appreciate the fact that I think as conservatives, that conservatism properly understood has to transcend any one particular outcome, even in something as important as the election of a president of the United States. And what I mean by that is this. If it's true that voter fraud occurred on such a level and such a scale that not just a few bad actors, but just about key players in every major institution in American life were complicit in either making that happen or just missed it, from the elected officials to the politicians to the local folks to the courts and the judges, right? It could be that we had a scenario where there was just real institutional failure, right?
Yes.
And by the way, you still have Democrats who think that that's basically what happened in 2004 on a smaller scale in Florida. You still got Democrats who think that, and a lot of folks on the left forget this, but folks still think that George W. Bush was not the legitimately elected president of the United States in that election. But put that aside. The thing that allows us to have a society is institutions that work. Institutions that work are based on the relationships that we have, not just with our elected officials, but with our neighbors who are going to be electing the people who make decisions in our institutions and otherwise, set the pieces in place for those institutions to function. Right. If we are committed to preserving the republic, right? If we are committed to preserving our democratic republic, we have to find a way to be able to sit down with our neighbors, look each other squarely in the eye, and figure out how we can stand shoulder to shoulder together. First of all, to reason together, to figure out how we can share an understanding of what happened, see where we can agree, acknowledge where we disagree, but then figure out how are we going to fix and strengthen our institutions moving forward so that we can have confidence in the way our system works. The alternative to that is pushing for a civic divorce. The alternative to that is shutting down the lines of communication. The alternative to that is our not being able to make the courts work, our not being able to make Congress work, our not being able to make our local school boards work, our not being able to worship together, our not being able to stay married in our own households, because you got folks who just can't stand each other because wife voted for Biden, but husband voted for Trump, and now the kids, now the kids got to suffer because of that. All of these things, all of these tears, contention is a work of the flesh. That's what it says in the Gospels. That's what we are committing ourselves to if we don't see the project of saving America and saving this republic as ultimately tying in to the relationships that we have with our neighbors. We've got to see to it that the institutions hold, even if the institutions failed. Well, and I think that that's what some folks have forgotten.
Yes, and I mean, it used to be common wisdom to, when we have a block party, when we invite the neighbors over for a barbecue, we don't talk about religion or politics. Why did we consider that to be wise? Well, because we valued those people without even knowing how they vote. We already valued them. I don't want to mess with that by a political disagreement that will then cause me not to value them. We knew instinctively that this could divide us. Let's not let it. And we now, because of media, we've probably gone to the place where we're always going to have to understand where our voters, where our friends and neighbors differ from us. But if we could make the turn, the intellectual turn into understanding that what I just said, that we always were able to think of them as a resource before we knew we had a small difference, why can't we think of maybe some of the difference was the resource? Maybe they were valuable enough friends to us because they did see the world slightly differently from us. And start thinking, okay, you're different than me or different from me. I'm different from you. That gives us an advantage in that we see each problem from two angles. You can help me see around a corner in a sense, because you see the backside of this issue and I see only the one side of it. If we're on each side of it like this, giving each other information always, hey, I see a flaw in your thinking over here. I'm on the other side of this problem. And I see there's a weak spot in your thinking. Oh, wow, I didn't think of that. And we could be approaching things as if we're circling the problem, a liberal and a conservative circling around the same problem. We're going to see all angles of it better than just two conservatives circling that problem or two liberals.
That's right. Well, that's what we want to get to. Now, I think that for a lot of folks, there is the sense that, at this point in American history, given what, let's, speak, referencing our conservative friends and so forth, for a lot of folks, there's sort of the sense that at this point in American history, well, what in the hell do liberals and progressives and leftists have to offer, that's of any value to anybody else? We've sort of taken it for granted that the things that they do at best out of ignorance and moral perversion, and at worst, out of hatred and an obsession with power, right? And I think the thing that we got to recognize in all side of things is that, I come at this with something of a theological frame, but not only is it true what you said a little earlier, that, some actors saying something crazy doesn't necessarily speak for everybody on a certain side of an issue. Not only is it true that there are different sorts of folks on each side of the equation, but each individual is potentially one way or another, given the time of day and the context that they're in, given what's going on.
Wow.
Why?
That's true.
And this includes you and me, Dave. Why? It's because, if I'm going to just speak about it in a Christian sort of frame, just really quick, we are all born in sin, and we all are available to the lower impulses of our nature in the absence of, a vision of something higher. But even then, part of what I believe God wants for us to do is to edify one another. And we can only do that by loving one another. And this is why the gospel says that love is long suffering. This, by the way, is also why we became braver angels. We originally better angels, and part of it was trademark dispute, I'll be honest. But the other part of it is recognizing the fact that if you're going to try and see the good in the other side, you're going to get hammered for that, both by the person who disagrees with you politically and by the person who agrees with you politically, but doesn't think you ought to be talking to that Nazi over there, right?
Right.
When you love the way Christ asks us to love and the way he loved, you love in a way to where you are willing to speak the truth, but to heal the other person, even if that person is going to respond with a fist or with a sword or with a lash.
Right.
We take the wounds, we take the blows, we take the hatred from other folks, and we find a way to stand in the fierceness of truth and of a godly love in return. Because if we can endure it, if we can show that signal to the other side that, look, we are not here speaking this truth because we are your enemy. We want a better world for everybody. Regardless of what you think about me today, you may have learned something from me by tomorrow. That's what allows us to be righteous, to do what is good. And that's what Dr. King, I think, did demonstrate in his own time. This idea of loving your opponent and creating the beloved community and so forth. This is the power that we have to get back in touch with. And we can't do it if we think that all the sin is loaded up on the other side. And relatively speaking, we don't have too much to apologize for. We all fall short of the grace of God.
I want to jump back and notice something that you hit glancingly, that not only can all of them not be described by one tweet, any of them cannot be described by one moment of conversation on a given day. We might be looking at a bad mood, but the problem that humans have is we sort of attach to things arbitrarily in some ways. Like when I'm trying to get on the freeway, right, and I look ahead and my spot is between the white car and the gray car. Right, that's my spot. But the gray car just speeded up and he cut me off. Well, it was only arbitrary that I thought that was my spot in the first place. But I attached to it in a millisecond, and I shot for that thing, and then I was, prevented. So screw you,
Now you feel indignant.
Yeah, and I when I noticed that about myself, I started looking at a lot of the things that I thought I stood for or was really attached to, and realized, that just kind of was a stand I made in a conversation with that one guy that one day. And I've been defending it ever since. In a sense, it was arbitrary based on a mood I was in that day. And I attached to it like a duckling attaching to the farmer and following him around, it's
Yeah.
if we just know that we are not faultlessly logical, we're
Mm.
not computers, we're these biological entities with all kinds of complications, and we're fitfully rational at best. And just admitting that about myself has really helped liberate me, and it's allowed me to back out of some of the stands that I might have been stuck with,
Mhm.
just by, well, I'm maybe, I admit it. I'm only fitfully rational. I'm just a dude,
Yeah,
you know.
likewise, brother. Fitfully rational. That's and maybe that's it best.
So I wanted to just, we're coming to the end here, but I just have, in talking about Brett Weinstein, I follow his podcast, and I've been understanding that the sort of the framing of the battle against the worst elements on the left is being done best by people on the left,
Mm.
because they're already over there. And so I have tended to separate. Liberals are kind of the good guys on the other side, and progressives are kind of the bad guys because they're trying to progress society. And the activists, I tend to think, they're progressives. But now that I've gotten to listen to Brett and Heather talking about things, and boy, nobody goes harder than they do against this other group, the woke. So it
Mhm.
seems to me like it's kind of coming down to a thing where we could have in common a regular conservative person and a regular liberal person. We're both being threatened by this sort of wokeness thing
Mm.
that just seems to be a feedback loop out of control. It's feeding upon itself, and the frequencies have just gotten out of control, and now it's just a howl.
Mm. Yeah.
That's musician speak, folks. So, but
Yeah.
it seems like that there's this little wedge there, and I think that little wedge of the woke over there, and on the other side, that little wedge which is the alt-right and the QAnon types. I think I'm as willing to fight the outside edges on the right
Mm.
if my liberal friend a little ways across the dividing line is willing to fight their outside edges. I'm
Mm.
willing to fight. I'm willing to clean up my perimeter
Mm.
out here, because it's really hard for me to go over the heads of the liberals I could agree with and try to fight their outside edge. And I hate to have them have to defend their outside edge because I'm sort of over on their turf,
Mm.
fighting where maybe I don't belong. Does that make any sense at all to you?
Well, look, yeah, you're pointing to a dynamic that's real, and there's a lot that's positive that comes out of it, even if it's the result of something troubling, which is the fact that, just speaking to the left and the hard left really quick, there is a divide there which is causing many folks who are traditionally Democrats, traditionally liberals, to realize that on certain fundamental issues, among them freedom of speech, a desire to see a society that minimizes the significance of race in favor of one in which we can all treat one another equally on equal standing, they actually have foundational commonalities with conservatives that they never appreciated before, because those commonalities didn't matter as much so long as there was a basic level of philosophical unity on the left, which made the important differences matters of policy, even social values, everything from healthcare to taxes to gay marriage, right?
Right.
And so now there's sort of a recognition of the fact that, hey, for folks who traditionally consider themselves liberals, and for folks, most folks at least, who would call themselves conservative, there's some bedrock things that we've got to work together to conserve in order to preserve the liberal vision of society that used to be in vogue, right? And
Right.
so that's generated a new space, which is pretty amazing to see. Now, having said all that, I would say that, for me, being a person who, well, I'll put it like this. One of the reasons it was important for me to make the points that you remember me making on that podcast panel with Brett Weinstein was to tell a story of the Black experience in particular,
Mm-hmm.
which shines a light on where so much of the anger is coming from in the present day, in a way that I hope showed that there's a little bit more justification to the indignation that a lot of folks, even out in the woke space, feel with respect to how it is that the systems and structures of our society continue to keep people locked in place in terms of the quality of life and so forth that they could enjoy than other folks realize. I am somebody who thinks that both conservatives and liberals have been blind to so much of the history that I articulated in that podcast, and therefore don't really see how some real things in our past still, even, through the age of Obama and even Oprah Winfrey and, and all of the folks across America, people of color who we can point to and say are leading great lives, and they are, and I'm one of them. But there are other stories that aren't necessarily getting the airtime until recently that people way out on the woke left are looking at and saying, hey, you know what? Folks haven't been paying attention to this history, to these injustices. We've got to wake people up, and let's take no prisoners in doing so, because we've got a cause that we're fighting for. So I get where a lot of those folks are coming from. And I would even add to that way out on the other side of things, way out in, alt-right territory and so on and so forth. Look, you're not going to catch me saying, too much positive about the idea of embracing, white supremacy and so on and so forth. But I would say that for a very long time in America, the mainstream of American culture, the mainstream of American society, and in some respects, this is possibly even true with respect to the sort of establishment lane of conservative America, where, I can name many folks who I admire and many people doing many good things, have been deaf to the fact that the cultural stepchildren of American society, in addition to, people of color, people in the inner city, people in urban communities, so on and so forth, but the other cultural stepchildren of American society have been many poor white folks, folks in Appalachia, folks who speak with a certain accent, folks who have a certain cultural upbringing, the type of folks you don't want in your universities, the type of folks we don't want to put on our TV shows unless they're a comic book caricature, of themselves. The type of folks who we don't really invest much time or thought in, who feel themselves rejected by an American story that is embarrassed by them, and they know it,
Yes.
There's all sorts of suffering all across the spectrum that explains something of the passion coming at us from all sides, even if we think of it as sort of irrational. Might be a little bit more rational than we realize if we stop to appreciate the depth of the pain that folks, less advantaged than ourselves, right and left, are experiencing. Because, it's easy to miss it. It's easy to miss it if you're not living it.
And there's never been the sort of until Donald Trump came along, there's never been sort of any sympathy going out to the people that you just mentioned. Whereas right. You thought, okay, there has at least been sympathy going out to people of color in these circumstances. Yeah. At least there's been some recognition of it, however imperfect it might be. And there's been these hillbilly elegy people who have really not gotten any love, and have not only that, been the one group of people that it was okay to mock. If you wanted to talk about how stupid somebody was, you went ahead and did this voice. You know what I mean? Yep. And I used to do that as a kid. I never used the N-word once, but I used that voice a lot of times.
That's right. I say to Republicans and conservatives, and not just to them, but particularly for Republicans and conservatives who don't like Donald Trump, who want to see the party go in another direction, that, Trump did all sorts of things. The most important thing he did, and that I think was actually sincere coming from Trump, was that he really did seek to connect with and show love to folks that nobody else was loving. In our politics, folks that nobody else wanted to connect to.
And boy, did they appreciate it.
That, that connection can be made. You can't beat Trump, because that, at least the need to do that, Trump got right. And I'm just Dave, just really quick, I just want to, point out the fact that Dr. King in his time, he reached out to those same folks, He fought for equal rights for Black Americans, but he fought for that for all Americans. My tutor in nonviolence, Harry Boyd, who's Scotch-Irish from the South, as a young teenager, he remembers being in the room when King was reciting his lines, getting ready to have the "I Have a Dream," deliver the "I Have a Dream" speech at the March on Washington. King sent Harry out to organize poor white folks because King felt that America had done wrong by Appalachia, in many ways similar to the ways in which it had underadvantaged, underprivileged its people of color, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's got to be this was King trying to help folks on the margins stand shoulder to shoulder. And frankly, if we could do it, I'd like to do that for the woke folks and the alt-right folks too. And I know that that's getting way out ahead of where people are at. And I know that we've got to start where we're at, but ultimately, if we're trying to be like Christ, man, how can we settle for anything less?
Well, you are blessed and cursed with a mind that is quite nuance oriented. And this is a tough time to be a nuanced thinker, but you really are. You as you go from thought to thought, you examine the thought that you've just left in your wake and move forward and pull it apart a little bit more. And that's the value of a mind like yours, and the challenge in a time like this. So I'd love to, any time in the future, I'd love to talk with you and be of any service I can to the organization. I guess later this week, tomorrow, is it? I get to do a little opening song for
Okay,
the national.
You're playing at our big conference meeting tomorrow. Is that right? Okay. Well, I'm looking forward to that.
I think I have to leave immediately after that. Those were my instructions. Sing a song and then leave through the kitchen, you damn musician.
Boot after that. There you go. Well, as long as you can drop a few bars on us, give us a few.
I'll do my best. I'm nervous.
We'll thank you on your way out.
But I thank you very much. Our hour is up, and I know you've got a busy day ahead of you. So I just think that maybe we're at a closing place now. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
Man, just that for folks who are interested in the work that we do, the mission that I'm describing, I know we didn't get to talk too much about the day-to-day activities of Braver Angels. It involves a lot. Debates, face-to-face conversations, working together in our communities, playing music together. Building a movement that transcends the divides and gets us back to being American again. Excuse me.
Right.
If you're interested in that, then join up with us. We're at braverangels.org, and you are welcome to step through that door. All of you who are listening. So,
well, thank you so much. And anytime you feel like you need to contact my bunch of crazies out there, and my hillbillies, so to speak. Just give me a shout and we'll get you on the air.
Will do. You'll be hearing from me. Thank you.
All right, man. I'm going to go ahead and end this then. Thank you very much.
Be well.
Thanks for watching. If you like this video, subscribe to our channel and then click the little bell to get notifications.